Well, hello everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here again. We've got a fun-filled day for you with some interesting topics to talk about. And today's topic is winning over stakeholders. Your presenters today are me, Peter Maddison. I'm a partner at Zodiac Consulting, and I'm here to give you a bit of a talk. And I've got a colleague of mine here, Mike Swan, who is joining us. And so Zodiac, a little bit about Zodiac. Zodiac's a boutique consulting company that helps organizations align business strategy to technology execution. So if you're struggling to get aligned and get product out the door, that's where we come in, and we help you get your teams organized, get your strategy organized, and get the two things connected together. So Mike, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm Michael Swan. I'm an associate here at Zodiac. I've been working with Peter and Zodiac for a couple of years now, and also do fractional CXO and advisor work across multiple companies, and really helping people uh, solve complex business problems. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today because winning over stakeholders is absolutely something that can send projects and programs in the wrong direction, and there's some simple things we can do to make it happen.
Excellent. So, without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So, we'll give a quick introduction to stakeholders and what the context and the framing that we put around this, and then we're going to go through each of three key elements around how you engage with stakeholders around incentives, communication, alignment, and then we're going to wrap it all up with some Q&A. So, there's probably about 30 minutes of us talking through some of these pieces, and feel free to ask questions as we go along. And we look forward to answering any questions at the end. Thanks. So without further ado, let's start with just a basic definition. What is a stakeholder? So a stakeholder who is somebody who has some sort of responsibility or interest in the project or the work that you're doing. And stakeholders can come from lots and lots of different areas and different avenues. We can think of stakeholders as being both external and internal. And we have this if we think of internal stakeholders, often your internal stakeholders are going to be your employees, the people who own the company, or the people who have got larger responsibilities for pieces of work. You can have managers, you can have the project areas, or anybody who has any kind of impact from the work that is being done. So in terms of external stakeholders, you want to talk through some of the sort of the external stakeholders we see, Mike?
Certainly. I mean, sometimes this is lost. It's important for a program within the company, but often there's stakeholders and external stakeholders that you need to be able to address as well, whether it be key suppliers into the program and what it means for them to be for you to be successful, whether it's key customers or what you're bringing to the customer base, and never forgetting that depending on the industry you're in. Personally, Peter and I do a lot of work in financial services and some other heavily regulated industries. Those bodies could also be stakeholders into what you're trying to achieve and making sure that you've achieved success within your corporation. And lastly, investors and shareholders, whether it's looking at investors from a standpoint of new money you're trying to bring in if you're a startup, or existing shareholders within the company. All of those have some vested interest in, potentially have some vested interest in the success of the program, one way or the other. So it's anybody inside or outside that needs to be engaged in order for your success as a stakeholder.
Exactly. And if we want to think about how do you get these stakeholders, all of these people from these different avenues who have an interest in what it is that you're doing, how do you get them on board? I mean, ultimately, we want happy stakeholders, people, all of our stakeholders, everybody who's engaged to be happy with what it is that we're doing. And that can take an awful lot of work. Um, so if
So
we think about this.
yeah, and so this is something I find a lot of is really understanding what does a stakeholder need. There's sort of a kind of a simple, to make it very simple and bring it down from the complex of all of the things that you could discuss with a stakeholder. if it came down to understanding what they really need in order for them to be successful and understanding how you can make them successful, and then how would you actually communicate with that stakeholder, or what type of communications are they interested in? And the reason that comes up is, and we'll go into this in a little more depth later on in our discussion, is how a stakeholder wants to be communicated to can actually inform you a lot on what their level of engagement is, which is key to being successful within a program. And the last one is alignment or adaptability. So, how can you actually help bring that all together? But the challenge is on that one is everybody wants happy stakeholders. What you
Yeah.
really need is engaged stakeholders. And Peter, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the differences between those two.
Yeah, so there's this piece that your stakeholders can be happy and like, oh yeah, no, I'm getting what I need. It you're giving me the information I need. I feel like we're going in the right direction, and like I'm happy about that. But really, what you want is you want stakeholders who are engaged in the outcome, ones who are going to like provide you the feedback you need to help make sure that you are on track, that things are going the way that they're supposed to go, that they are ready to engage and provide the information you need when you need it, so that you can actually move forward and be successful with the initiatives that you're running. In terms of, so that's kind of interesting. There's a bit about stakeholders, internal, external, and the sort of three sort of main aspects that we're thinking about. So now we're going to dive a little deeper into each of those and talk about them in turn, and some of the sort of pros and cons and aspects, and how we see this turning up when we interact with clients. So you want to go through this, Mike?
So now let's talk about really what's in it. Human nature. What's in it for me? What's in it for them? Why would the stakeholder want to engage in the program, and what is what is it really going to bring to them, and how they're being measured, right, within that. And that measurement is actually going to do a lot in deciding as to how engaged that they are within the product, within that. And then the other side of it is do the incentives that they have actually align with the organizations. So this could be a little bit of a trap. And Peter's going to talk in a moment about how different organizations might have different incentives, and how, if your program is cross organizational, how that can all come together. But looking at it and saying, the other challenge is that incentives can often be misset and can go wrong. So the incentive that somebody has to be successful may not actually help you get the outcome that you need within that. And so anecdotally, I'll talk about one that I was chatting with Peter earlier today on. Was, here's just an example of an incentive that has completely gone wrong. Anecdotal from a way number of years ago, where product management set a sales incentive based on a feature versus the product itself. Their goal was to get them more products sold. How it was incented was, we would need to sell more features of a certain feature. What happened was the sales organization took that and realized that they could now count every sale they'd previously made of another product that now had the same feature in it. So at the end of it, the sales organization was really, really, really happy, because they could show that they sold all of this feature. The product organization was completely unhappy because none of their new product had gone out the door. Right within that, the incentive was misaligned. And there's an example of, as I said, looking across organizations and understanding is, will incentive one meet incentive two? And Peter was the idea then is that, would an incentive actually get you the outcome that you want, and is it aligned with where they want to go? So Peter, maybe just want to give a little more color on that. I know you have an anecdote in this space as well, and talk a little bit about how different organizations might be incented and what that might mean to our programs.
So a common one that we see here is, of course, in the technology space, where you have delivery teams are incented to build software that's going to enable the business and grow the capabilities and release new capabilities out to the customers. And you have operations teams who are incented to ensure that those things are stable. So there's a focus, there's a different focus across these two different areas, where your technology teams are often looking at how do I accelerate delivery of new capabilities, and I've got to get stuff into the hands of customers. And your operations teams are, hey, how do I manage risk? How do I prevent things going down? How do I ensure that things are stable all the time? And this is your typical DevOps sort of friction that you see between the two. And once we start to broaden that and look holistically across the organization, we can start to see where just fundamentally there can be misalignment across different areas. And this is where understanding what are the incentives that are driving people becomes so critical with respect to stakeholders. Why are your stakeholders looking for the things that they are looking for? How are they measured? How are they looking to be successful from whatever programs you're running? Because understanding that will help you understand what they need, which in turn leads into both the communication and alignment that we're going to be talking about later in this talk.
So an interesting one. I'll give you an idea as we continue to talk a little about the incentives. Is having a conversation in the industry, and a product manager was telling me about a situation where trying to get things aligned. The head of sales' incentive was to sell as much as possible. The COO made the comment that that's the worst thing that could happen to the company, because they had to manage capacity and throughput and being able to grow that out. Meanwhile, the product manager is trying to figure out how to get investment, and the head of service delivery thinks that the product might carve into what their business is. And so, as trying to get stakeholder alignment with that is, well, how do you actually start thinking about those three very different aspects that are very typical in a lot of companies, of sell as much as you can, but wait, I've got to worry about capacity and flow, but wait, I've got to worry about where is that revenue coming from? Is one cannibalizing another? And it becomes a complex problem. But looking at those incentives will give you a lot of information on how to potentially solve that problem.
And incentives are, I think Sam Altman had a blog post he published recently on this around, I think the language he used was that incentives are a superpower, but you've got to use them very carefully, because as you were describing earlier, Mike, the wrong incentives can very much drive the wrong outcomes. So that's sort of talking through what stakeholders are, the internal, external, and talked a bit about the incentives and why it's so important to understand what are the incentives that your stakeholders have. What are they looking for from the program? Because understanding that will help you understand this next bit, which is like, well, how do we need to communicate with them? So communications are absolutely critical, and this is often where we see problems arise in organizations, especially with larger change initiatives where there's lots of moving parts, and coordinating all that communication, thinking about what different types of communication, different types of stakeholders are going to want, is really, really critical. Like if we think of communication styles, some people will want to be communicated to, just send me a report on a weekly basis, or I'll be fine with going and looking at whatever your work board looks like, or I'm happy as long as you meet with me on a regular cadence and tell me how things are going. Depending on who the person and what their interest is, they are want to communicate in different ways. And it's really, really important right at the outset to get really, really crisp and clear on what are those communication styles. How does somebody want to be communicated with? And setting up the framework around what that communication looks like right at the outset is really, really key to make sure that your stakeholder management goes well. And the last part here, and this is goes for all communication really, but remembering to listen. remembering to really, really listen to what it is your stakeholders are saying and thinking about, well, why are they asking what they're asking for? And this ties back into incentives. Like what are they being incentivized by? Why is it that they're looking for that? What's underlying their questions? And remember to listen so you can try and understand and start to ask questions about what is driving their desire to be communicated to in that way or that frequently or that infrequently. Like what's behind that? So a little bit of role play here. And so Mike, in your senior roles you've done, let's think as a CIO, if you've just been briefed on a new product introduction, and the program for this product introduction may require minor updates across many IT systems, and it's currently unknown which ones and just how much of it. But as the CIO, how would you want to be informed of the progress of this program?
Well, Peter, obviously, well, Peter, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I think I need weekly updates on this. Can you make sure that by Tuesday morning, I've got a written report on what's happening with the program or some level of update that tells me exactly what's going on? I'd also like to know exactly when you're going to know what the impacts are going to be and specifically which areas that you're going to need changes made. If I respond like that, what does that tell you?
Well, it says you're very, very concerned about the initiative. So there's clearly something underlying because we've introduced this. These are minor updates into a few systems. So why are you so concerned? So there's the question back is, so what's driving that concern? What is it that you see about this initiative that is potentially risky, or there is potentially something that you need to, at your level, really be paying attention to?
So what if I answered back and said, Peter, thank you for the update. I'd like a monthly check-in and just make sure that you're keeping the head of operations involved.
Yeah, so this says that you're less interested in being involved directly in it, that you trust your head of operations to take care of the details of it. It's not something you feel you should be spending your attention with, and that you're okay with being updated at a more infrequent basis. Uh, and I think in these two cases, there's potentially understanding of what the underlying risk is. There's also an underlying piece here to understand from an individual perspective. If somebody at a senior level is that interested in it, understanding like what's driving that, what's underlying that, why would they feel the need to have to pay that much attention to something like this or an initiative like this?
And I think what's key in that is understanding as much as exactly you hit it as if I'm heavily engaged and you said it was a minor update, there's something I see that you don't, or another question that you potentially need to ask as to why do you think this requires more, or there's something else potentially in how I'm being measured. Maybe it's there's absolutely no wiggle room in the budget, or something else has to stop in order for something to start, right? And looking at where it is with the incentive of that, but also again, it really comes back to how much you can tell by what I ask about and what I don't ask about. And you're correct. If I say that I don't need a heavy update and you just need to keep somebody in operations informed, I've believed from the information that you've sent me that I've made an immediate risk assessment that I don't need to be there. And that goes back into the conversation of the risk. So if you go back to the idea of what's in it for me, understanding what I need, and then how I actually want to be communicated to will tell you a lot about, did you really understand what I need within that? Within that piece.
Yeah. And reminding you to go back and say, I think you ought to be more concerned about this than you are.
Well, the other answer is how fast can you come back and tell me what the impacts are, and then I'll make that decision,
Yes.
which is the middle road of go back and really understand the risks and then come back to me. And that's the middle road is do I engage or not? Because I'm going to have to make a very quick decision on that based on size of program, where the impact is going to be on the organization, and how I'm being measured for it.
So with that in mind, we've covered up like what stakeholders are. We've talked about the incentives. that drive different types of behavior and why it's so critical to understand what the incentives of your stakeholders are. We talked about the communication and how to look at and start to analyze communication style and start to think a little more deeply about why are your stakeholders asking to be communicated with in the way that they're asking to be communicated with. And so now we're going to talk a bit about the third piece that we had on our diagram, which is alignment. So the key pieces here are around transparency. If you want to get to alignment, you really need transparency around all of the information. A lot of alignment or a lot of things get out of alignment or become misaligned because there's information is missing, or it's not easily available, or it hasn't been communicated in the way that that person is expecting to be communicated with. And because of that, you don't. There are people get upset, or they go off and start to look for things themselves, or they might start driving things in the wrong direction, and all of a sudden you end up with no little amount of chaos. So that's absolutely critical that we have transparency. The second piece around ensuring alignment is co-creating the goals, involving all of the critical stakeholders who are on what are the goals, what are the outcomes of this initiative? Are we all aligned as to what it is we're doing here? What success is going to look like? So co-creating those goals, putting them into place, writing them down, ensuring that everybody can see them the same way. And it is critical to write them down because this allows everybody to read and understand it. If somebody's in a meeting listening, nodding their head, and they just happen to get a message and they're not listening, so they miss things. So it's absolutely critical that you write down what are the intended outcomes of the initiatives that you're running, and then making it measurable. And so a good framework that's common in the market at the moment is using OKRs for this, to say objectives and key results are goals, and making sure that they measure. So how are we going to measure progress towards our goals? What does that look like? Do you want to add some more to this, Mike?
So this is an area I think that sometimes gets misinterpreted a little bit when you go onto it. When you don't have it, you can find out pretty quickly when you don't have alignment between those. And then you have to understand as to how flexible can the program be to adjust that alignment. And or ask the question, does it need to be flexible? One area, and this goes back to one of the earlier comments, is we need engaged stakeholders. Having happy stakeholders is wonderful, but sometimes I've seen one of the big downfalls to a program is trying to make everybody happy, and in the process, changing the whole scope and goal of the program, so it doesn't actually achieve the end goal in the first place. So when you don't have alignment, we do have to look at, what would make this a win-win situation, right? If that doesn't exist, how do you get down to, and how do we make sure that the key areas of the program get through and we can keep people engaged, but not everybody will be happy within that, right? And from that is, again, going through this process, understanding where everybody stands, what the communications to, but then sticking in the, okay, and here's how we're going to go forward. And then managing the ones that are, at least if they're engaged, you can actually manage that capability versus having them completely unengaged, which will lead to program failure in a lot of situations. And certainly a lot of transformation programs fail. And this is one of the key areas that they do fail in. So, Peter, what are some of the techniques you might want to use, or how you might want to look at if we want to get to a win-win or a win-neutral situation?
So, I think we've laid out some of the ones here, or some of the sort of the pieces that are critical behind it. The making sure that you have captured the concerns of everybody, making sure that when you're having these conversations, they're very inclusive, that you're making sure everybody's involved in the discussion, and that that information is communicated and radiated well out to the organization as you're making those decisions. This is something that'll help with the common understanding. When it comes to situations, and if we pick something like, hey, we need to put this piece of functionality in front of a client, but in order to do so, we need to do some things which are outside of our normal security requirements. So then you really need to bring those security parties to the table and have a very open conversation around, look, this is what we're trying to do. And now some of this is always going to require situations where, hey, I'm dealing with the Department of No, and I want to get to the Department of Yes, and this is how we can help you do that. And so the part of this is to understand, how do we line up these two different these pieces? How do we get to a common understanding of what is going to be sufficient to meet the needs of security, while still delivering the capabilities that we need in order to support our business moving forward? What do we need to have in place to make that work correctly? So this is the kind of sort of techniques we can use to make sure that we bring people together and collaboratively work on a solution. But just with keeping it in mind that you will need compromise on both sides to eventually get to a solution that's going to work.
So to wrap that, to wrap it all together before we go into next information, is really what we've talked about to getting the stakeholder alignment is understanding what's really in it for the stakeholder, understanding why they'd want to be engaged and what incentive they need to be engaged. The second one is understanding how they really want to be communicated to, and listen closely to them to understand, what they're telling you in that communication style as to how engaged they are, and ask questions within that to make sure that you've got the right interpretation within it. And lastly is be flexible, because you need to be able to look at those top two, and without losing sight of what the program needs to achieve, how flexible can you be to make sure that you've met the stakeholder incentive and had the proper communications to make that work and bring it together. And I think all of these are, I try to make it a little oversimple within this, but it really can be that simple to build that relationship and get stakeholders engaged. Peter, do you want to go take it from there?
Yep. So we've gone through like an introduction around what are stakeholders, internal, external stakeholders, different types of stakeholders you have at the table. We've talked about incentives, what sort of behaviors incentives drive, and truly understanding the incentives of your stakeholders and how that can help you work out what you need to do. The communication, understanding the communication styles of your stakeholders, how they want to be communicated with, documenting that, making sure that's well understood, and thinking about the different ways in which different people might want different communication methods and cadences. Thinking about as well, listening very, very closely to your stakeholders to see what are they asking, and then remembering to go back and ask, how does that align with what their incentives are? And are there incentives that you may not be aware of that might be driving behaviors or needs that you need to dig into a little further and really truly understand? And all in all, this lines up to, like, how do we create alignment across the program to make sure that we are doing what we can to give the stakeholders what they need, but while understanding that we're not going to be able to keep everybody happy all of the time, and making sure that we're doing the right things while still keeping our eyes on the prize and making sure that we are still walking towards the same outcomes. With that, we're going to wrap up and we'll dive into the Q&A. If you're interested in learning more, here are a few books which we think are good books to read and have some great pieces of information that will help drive the thoughts around this area. Daniel Pink's Drive, Autonomy, Mastery, and Purpose is a great model to start to think about not just what are incentives, but how can we start to create the types of incentives that will help and align our stakeholders across our initiatives. The software for your head talks about the core protocols, thinking about what are the behaviors that we want to have, how do we want to see communications occurring across the organization, are people communicating well, how do we set up and structure our communication patterns for healthy communication. And Dale Carnegie's "How to Win Friends and Influence People" is obviously a classic to think about how we get to the point of understanding, influencing, and creating alignment across our organizations. With that in mind, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And you can reach out to us here. This is our emails and LinkedIn. And if you scan the QR code, it'll take you to a form where there's a really, really short sort of 2-minute survey, just asking if there's any feedback, anything else you'd like us to talk about. Is there anything we could do better with these calls? And it's been a pleasure. So with that, I'll hand it over for any questions there might be. If there are any. Or do we do such a good job that everybody knows how to handle all of their stakeholders now? I was thinking of there were some other anecdotes we had around incentives that were kind of interesting, where we've seen organizations manage to go off the rails by looking at the wrong incentives, or not understanding what the incentives they have are driving in the organization. I mean, the age-old classic being things like lines of code, where if you ask developers for more lines of code, you'll get more lines of code, but they're not necessarily going to be lines of code you need. And fewer lines of code is actually better. So these are the sorts of things to consider.
Or that understanding what's measured within the program. That great meme that one of our colleagues posted to LinkedIn a few months ago, that of customers and product management asking where their feature is, and development talking about how they're killing their DORA metrics, and really understanding what that value is and what the message is, and how what is measured, but really being able to translate that message into something that means something to the value of what's being delivered. Is again going back into how much of a pitfall the measurement can be, and it all needs to be context dependent, right, on what you're really trying to get within the outcome, and matching your KPIs with your OKRs, and then seeing is that actually what you're going to get. If, looking at it as one being a view of where you want to get to, and one being an indicator of what you're doing.
Yes, yeah, because I mean those DORA metrics can be absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, technology organizations can get very hung up on DORA and not think about like what does the organization as a whole need, because they're very specific to how good are your technical capabilities, like how good are you at delivering technology, not necessarily how good are you at creating product for your customers, or whether the customers care about the product you're producing. So
we do have a question here, right? Okay, we've got two stakeholders at senior level, completely at odds with each other. What do you do? What do we do to be able to get that understanding that within that? You mentioned some techniques earlier, but hey, what are some techniques? If you think about, let's work out an actual scenario of whether it's at odds of investment, or at odds of what's actually being delivered.
So it's I mean, trying to find a common ground is obviously one of the first things you need to look for. If two people are coming from polar opposite approaches, and they both might have very good justifications for their points of view, and they can both be correct, there is an element of and this is where some of of course, it becomes very political often in larger organizations around finding out what you can look at this from the perspective of what's the best thing for the delivery, what is the best thing for driving the outcome that I'm looking to drive for, and coming up with ways of explaining what that might look like. And again, going back to what we were saying, looking at, well, what's driving that incentive? Why does each of those stakeholders want to do things in the way they want to do them? If you had something like somebody wants to use a product that's off the shelf to build out a solution to a client, and the other person believes that they'd be better building this all internally and creating it themselves. And now there's two sides to this. I mean, looking at which one of these things might be the better thing to do. They both have pros and cons, and it largely is going to depend on how critical is what's being done to the organization as to which direction you might want to go. So understanding what's driving each of the stakeholders in this? Why are they coming from different directions at this? What is it that they're looking to see that's underlying this? Is it that they want to go outside because there's been previous experiences when we've tried to build things internally, we've not done a good job, or it hasn't been stable, or it's cost us a lot to maintain or support over time? And so we want to try doing an outsource or buy a third-party product, or we don't see this thing as being key to our internal business. So why we're not in the business of, for example, doing email distribution. So why should we go and build an email distribution server? So this type of thing, so deciding where are we going to go with that. What would you add to this, Mike?
Well, I mean, one of the things, unfortunately, we have to deal with is, what if it is purely political?
Yeah.
Right? It's and remembering we're all human in this situation, and trying to understand as well. It's that. How is the person next to me going to be more successful than me, or what could I do, or why should I support, or anything like that? And unfortunately, that conversation happens more than we expect at that. And you run into the situation sometimes where across an executive team, and this is a little anecdotal, but to explain it, is that I'm not trying to be green, I'm just trying to be less red than the person next to me within it, which is a bit of a political nightmare as well, because you're trying to make sure you get your program done and make it for the best of the organization. But you need to understand some of those interactions, and then understand if there's any way they get around it. And sometimes it really is just, constantly communicating and constantly showing, but really trying to get back into, how can you get to that win-win away from win-neutral? And it's all context dependent, but it really does come down to constant communications and making sure that everyone understands that value to get past that type of situation. And then there's cases when you just have to say, well, this isn't going to work, and we should just stop this because we're not going to get any closer. And you hope you never get to that point, but it happens, unfortunately. So when I go back to the question at the end is, what do you do with odds? Listen, keep listening, and then communicate, and be very transparent about what's going on. There's got to be probably one overall project sponsor or program sponsor who needs to know about this. But that's really the ways to work around it.
Yeah, and if there is something that is contentious between them that could potentially be proved out, finding ways that you can quickly prove that and cheaply prove that can be a very powerful message as well. Having data is critical, right?
Nailed that one right on the head there, Peter. And that's also a key, is get away from the emotional argument.
Yeah.
And in one of those, when it comes down to it, a hard business data wins. And that you've got to be able to show that it's real, that this is what it's moving forward to, and get rid of some of the subjective or conjecture around why we should or shouldn't do something. And that's not always easy, but where possible, have the data to back up the argument and tell the story effectively.
Yep, exactly. Well, with that, I'd like to thank all our attendees, and we'll wrap it up for today. And until next time, we are looking to run these once a month, so you can sign up for our newsletter on the links that we share, and we'll update you on when the next webinar is and what it's going to be about. And look forward to next time. Yeah, thank you, Mike.
And thank you, Peter.